Do you want to start with the Global Compact on Migration?
You want to get to the Global Compact on Migration. As a good conservative, I'm avoiding the global... No, I'm not avoiding the Global Compact on Migration because this week, Andrew Scheer took a pretty clear stand, along with Michelle Rempel and a couple others. Yeah. I got into some Twitter debates online with some PPC people that were saying he was a day late. A day late.
I think they're talking about more than a day.
Come on, I saw
Bernier brought this to the House of Commons when he posted the petition like over a month ago, and he was literally laughed out of the room like he usually is whenever he says anything in the House of Commons.
The Conservatives are very clear on this.
Can you pass me the whiskey?
What's that? Yeah, sure. The Conservatives very clearly are saying that they are opposed to the UN Global Compact on Global Migration.
The whole title is let's
help the folks watching to understand what this is.
Yeah, it's a global agreement that has been made through the United Nations based off of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Mm-hmm. It's this like sweeping but non-binding agreement that most of the member countries have agreed to. I think there are currently 16 now that have pledged not to. I guess it's not a signature thing that's been also brought up a bunch that's not agreed to it.
It's not legally binding because a lot of the UN stuff that goes through is not legally binding.
Basically, none of it
because each country has their own legal system. But the thing that even if you go on the Wikipedia page for this, which is kind of interesting, is it says it is politically binding. And that's true. That's a great way of phrasing it. It's politically binding because a lot of politicians will say, we've signed on to something, we've made an international commitment, so we have to honor it, right? And even a lot of courts will invoke international treaties and such when they're making judgments. So in a sense, it's politically binding in that it can influence the judgment of politicians, judges, and others, right?
Yeah, and then exactly. This is even like that's the go-to retort which I've seen in the media, like the main one. Like everyone's fear-mongering about this agreement, but it's not legally binding. And it's like, okay, well, what's the point of the agreement at all? Like, obviously, like these international agreements turn out to be the framework for oncoming legislation, just like the Paris Agreement has led to the carbon tax. Of course, it's not immediately a legally binding agreement, but this is like there are troublesome kind of passages throughout the agreement that could be instituted into law, and I don't see any benefits to Canada on signing on to this agreement. Like, it seems like to me Canada already has a great immigration system and is known for having a very positive immigration system. It doesn't I don't see how we can't continue to just lead by example. There's been a lot of rhetoric from Trudeau and from our immigration minister about how we're going to lead the way in this, and that's seriously troubling because a lot of this, a lot of the things in the agreement is about will require a lot of money to run these huge international networks to make sure everyone's
in the rhetoric that's right in the House of Commons. Trudeau was saying the world needs more of Canada's immigration system. I would agree in large part. Again, Canada has a really good immigration system, and for the last many years the consensus has been that immigration, particularly to fill the shortages in the labor market, has been a really positive thing, and that's so true. But the problem is that this agreement talks about things like not allowing media organizations.
That's been the most controversial thing. At the bottom of every article, it's all like making fun of people on the right for making a big deal of it, and then at the bottom it's like, oh yeah, but this is kind of worrying.
But the agreement says that the government should discourage or not allow media organizations from promoting xenophobia or not allowing. So basically, if a media organization says we should have less immigration, that becomes something that the government can take them to task for.
Well, it says that they should promote positive coverage, and they shouldn't publicly fund any sort of discriminatory xenophobic conduct.
And
so it's like it's not like they need to take things down. Like there is a bit of overreaction on that front as well. But there is a bunch of weird sensitizing.
In addition to that, we're talking about governments being encouraged to offer social services to all migrants.
Yeah, it does blow up the kind of which is the kind of what's it called? The
welfare state, the social safety net.
The city, the they were a big thing with DACA and everything. It was the the name is totally escaping.
What, New Mexico? I don't know.
No. It's like the something city.
The
sanctuary cities.
Sanctuary cities. Yeah.
It's just kind of blowing up this sanctuary city.
Because when you...
And then not only that, it's like there's a bunch of language about how you have to promote your kind of the rights that you provide, that you can provide for these potential migrants. So it's like there's a bunch of language around basically you have to promote your welfare state to other countries.
We've had cases in Canada where refugee claimants actually get denied refugee status. So basically, it's determined that they're but in particular in this what I'm saying is that we've had refugee claimants where they get denied, so they have a bogus refugee claim, but it's found out that they've been claiming healthcare services for years and years, so they're not paying taxes, they're not citizens of the country, they have a bogus refugee claim, and they still are claiming our healthcare system. That's happened in Canada. And this, I think the UN Compact on Global Migration actually encourages that kind of practice, and that's problematic for a lot of countries.
So it really seems like a pie in the sky kind of initiative that doesn't really benefit Canada in any way, will be kind of taxing in the long run because it requires a bunch of kind of global infrastructure to set up. It's just it seems super unnecessary on all fronts. And then the media stuff here, I found the language. Is super worrying. And we didn't touch on it as much, but it says promote independent, objective, and quality reporting of media outlets, including internet-based information, including by sensitizing and educating media professionals on migration-related issues and terminology, investing in ethical reporting standards in advertising, and stopping allocation of public funding or material support for media outlets that systematically promote intolerance, xenophobia, racism, and any other forms of discrimination towards migrants.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. The idea that you have government officials educating journalists. That is the definition of propaganda. If you have the government telling journalists what they can report and tying funding decisions to that education, suddenly you no longer have independent media in your country.
It's really couched in this positive language, though. And then this was also kind of strange. The Global Compact is based on international human rights law and upholds the principles of non-regression and non-discrimination. By implementing the Global Compact, we ensure the effective respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights of all migrants, regardless of their migration status, across all stages of the migration cycle. Like, what does that even mean? I don't see how this agreement enshrines international human rights any more than current international human rights law. It seems totally redundant, but requires so much more from countries in terms of kind of infrastructure to support these. So, I don't know. Agreeing to this can only lead to kind of increasing levels of immigration, and I think that Canada should maintain the kind of structures that we have in place.
I don't see this as necessary for Canada in any way. I think that those problematic elements that we've talked about, especially given the fact that the Canadian government is considering funding media organizations, we talked about this last week, to the tune of almost $600 million. And now they're considering this as some of the criteria by which they will allocate that funding to media organizations, I think it's very dangerous.
And while I was reading all the content that was produced around this week, because it really blew up this week, it was hard not to think about that kind of $600 million, because there was so many articles calling out like the sheer and like the far right on opposing this, and there seemed to be very little kind of opposing voice even in the more right-wing news media. Notably, like Andrew Coyne like took Scheer to town, like even in that headline, like Scheer aligns with far right. Like it's pretty absurd, especially when you consider the other countries that have already refused to sign on. It's like the U.S., Hungary, Australia, Bulgaria, Poland, Israel, Estonia, Czech Republic, Croatia, Slovenia, Slovakia, Russia, China, Korea, Japan, Belgium, Denmark, Italy. Like maybe there's a couple countries that even a lot of journalists have pointed to be like kind of fear-mongery about this. Like it's like, oh, the Hungarians are doing this, Viktor Orban, the Poles. Like they always point to those as like radical right-wing countries for some reason. But like, come on, Belgium, Denmark, Japan.
Totally.
Like, I don't know. Like the only really positive article, or like, I guess negative article for the Global Compact was the Iveson article that you tweeted out as well.
Yeah.
And even that, it was like the 6th paragraph in the article where he said, "I'm against this." Like it was like,
because he said in broad strokes it was a good. It was aspirational, like you said. It was aspirational, but we shouldn't sign on to it. So he's
the first 3 paragraphs are about like conspiracy theories and it's not positive language. Around the kind of right-wing position on it, but then all of a sudden he kind of like switches and it's like, what? Like if you only looked at the first 3 paragraphs, as many people do.
We've got to move on to a couple issues soon, but like, not to tie this to too many other issues, but I mean, you've got this government in particular in Canada wields the power of the state, and in particular the power of the state's funding in so many ways. I mean, this week was another issue about the Canada Summer Jobs Grant. So, the Liberal government uses the Canada Summer Jobs Grant to enforce their doctrine, their ideology, by denying funding to groups that don't agree with them. They're using the media funding to deny funding to media organizations that don't agree with them, and what they're using are these international agreements to give them kind of political cover on it, and I think that's the dangerous point. They're getting rid of dissent, and they're using the international community to kind of cover for them.
It's certainly troubling. Also, on top of this whole global, in response to the signing of the signing, I don't even know what the proper terminology, in preparation for the official agreement of the Global Compact on Migration in Morocco on the 10th, I think. There are protests scheduled across the country for tomorrow, which is going to be Saturday, which I hope this episode will be out by then. Maybe it's today by the time you're watching this. And they're scheduled for noon at basically all the city halls in all the major cities across the country. There's one in Vancouver, Regina, Edmonton, Calgary, Ottawa, Toronto, and I think especially the one on Ottawa is going to end up to be quite large. It seems like Maxime Bernier, while the first ministers are still meeting, is going to be on Parliament Hill with the demonstrators. I wouldn't be surprised if a bunch of Quebec groups ended up going to the Ottawa one, because it doesn't seem like there is a protest in Quebec, and immigration-related things tend to be popular amongst Quebec groups. So I think and then I think a lot of people from Toronto are going to the Ottawa one, especially the passionate Faith Goldie kind of crew. I think the Ottawa one is going to get quite large, and I think a big part of it is the riots and the protests that are currently going on in France.
Right.
I've seen a lot of people in Canada adopting that yellow vest symbol either as profile pictures or literally wearing them and sharing their pictures on social media and stuff like this.
Mm-hmm.
I would not be surprised to see a lot of similar vests at these protests across the country.
But now the France protests are more about
carbon tax.
Carbon tax, yeah.
I would not be surprised if many of these protests turned into more general anti-Trudeau kind of demonstrations. Although the central thing is
anti-Trudeau and anti like you're saying globalist, like the signing on to Paris Accord to the UN Compact.
That I wouldn't mind. I would be. That's what I would expect. I'd be looking out to see how that turns out, because like we saw in France, they literally got the decision overturned, right?
Yeah.
And now there's some people calling for Macron to even step down, which I think is a bit absurd personally. Like there is a rules and precedent to kind of govern how these things are done.
Elected.
Can you imagine, like there's a lot of right-wing pundits calling for that. Can you imagine if there was like a bunch of Black Lives Matter or Antifa protests in the States, and like what these same right-wing pundits would say if the left-wing pundits said Trump should step down? Like it's like totally. I found it absolutely ludicrous.
The double standard there.
The double standard. These Canada tends to be like pretty politically apathetic, and France is definitely known to have these kind of revolts.
France likes to strike in general. You know, they like to do strikes. They like that's a
protests
and
strikes
stereotype. But Canada, for a lot of these international political movements, tends to be just a couple years late. You know, and it's tepid, but at the same time, if it's happening in France now, I could see similar things happening a year from now, 2 years from now.
I definitely see people being inspired by it. Yeah. So we'll see what that goes. I think we'll have a reporter on site at the Toronto rally at least.
Excellent.
So we'll see what he sees. Let's move on to Huawei and China.
Lead us off. What happened with Huawei, with Miss
Weng Zhao? I don't know. She's the CFO of Huawei and the daughter of one of the founders of Huawei. So she's quite an important character. And as far as I've read, her father is also like a reasonably high up member within the Communist Party of China. So they're definitely important figures. Like this is one of China's most prized brands, because typically they don't they haven't been able to compete on these kind of higher end stuff, especially on like the design side. Whereas Huawei, like they recently passed Apple for like largest market share and are second behind Samsung. So like this is like the like one of the prize like jewels of kind of the modern Chinese economy. She was on a flight that touched down in Canada before, like a transfer flight, and she was detained in Canada.
Why did she get arrested?
Well, she was the pretenses they've given are that Huawei has used a shell corporation to continue to sell products in Iran in violation of American and UN sanctions. So they've detained her for that reason. It seems like it must be more political to me, because like China and the U.S. are have been
in a tariff war,
trade war, and like things have recently become like even more interesting, because Trump has placed a deadline, a January 1st deadline, by which he's going to increase the tariffs on the $200 billion bundle of goods from 10% to 25%. So that's a pretty massive jump. But until then, there's a sort of ceasefire of sorts, where there's not going to be any sort of increased tariffs and stuff while they try and work out something. And it's a very short deadline, and obviously they're trying to get something wrapped up rather quickly. But it seems, from what I've read, it seems like the Canadian government arrested her on request of the American government, and they're asking that she get extradited. So I think this is particularly interesting, because it's a great example of how we fit as like a kind of smaller middle power between the kind of the superpower of the U.S. and the emerging kind of superpower of China. They're really throwing their weight around, and now all of a sudden we have this big opportunity where we can get involved. And but the Trudeau government has they've held a position on China throughout that I don't agree with. Trudeau has openly praised the Chinese government. Early on when he was prime minister, he was asked a question by the media that was like, "What's a country that you admire?" And he picks out China.
Even before that was even before he was prime minister. He was a liberal leader. Yeah.
And he refers to it. He says it's a basic dictatorship. He admits to it, but he that's the one that he chooses because they can change their economy on a dime. Just worrying stuff, and then we've tried to get to trade deals, which they even inevitably walked away from the table, not us. We haven't been, and then further, this has become even more complicated because the U.S. has started to really oppose China and really crack down on some of these negative practices. And I've been saying for a while, since we released our NAFTA video over the summer, that it would be an intelligent move for Canada to jump on to the kind of U.S. policy and start punishing some of these practices. It would be a good way to get us back on the same page with the U.S. Maybe they would give some capitulations, such as there's steel tariffs and stuff like that. If we were more aligned with the U.S., it seems like in this kind of Sino-American divide, we've jumped towards the Chinese side and away from our American allies. And while I can see people might view that as China's on the up and U.S. is on the down, we should start that's another thing. Trudeau made a huge investment in the new Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, tens of millions of dollars just to participate in this kind of new bank that's going to fund all these projects abroad, none of them in Canada. So it just seems like we're positioning ourselves on the Chinese side where no matter how big of a trade partner China is with us, I don't think they'll ever outcompete the United States. Just the kind of geographic kind of realities of the situation have made us completely intertwined with the U.S. when it comes to our economies. So it just seems like a very big opportunity for us to, because Justin Trudeau can totally grandstand and be no, we're not giving you to the U.S. We'll try her here, or he could cooperate. There's so many opportunities for him to.
I take a different view. I'm pretty sure when I was reading on this and watching the Prime Minister's statement as well as Chrystia Freeland's, they seem to actually be trying to actually remove themselves from the situation. Basically, what they said was that this was a decision made by the police. It was made in concert with the request from the U.S. government for extradition. And the way it gets political, of course, is that it's the Minister of Justice in Canada, so Jody Wilson-Raybould, who will have to sign off on extradition with what's called the International Agreement Group, I believe, IAG, is on their advice. So, and that's a branch of our Justice Department. So, I'm not saying Trudeau's completely out of the picture, obviously, because it's still a cabinet minister who's making the decision, right? But I do think that he seems to be trying to take the legalistic view. The extradition hearing is different than the actual decision for extradition, which will have to be signed off by the Minister of Justice. And the actual trial, if this woman is extradited to the States, the actual trial will be done under American law. So there's no criminal trial that would be done in Canada. So I do actually think that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister are trying to be careful with this.
Yeah,
the reasons you've said. The other angle that I'll just add in that I was reading about that's quite interesting is that America, along with a couple other countries, is among the only ones that have banned Huawei from their 5G network.
Yeah. And
the Conservatives in Canada are now calling for Huawei to be banned from Canada's 5G network, and we haven't. In Canada, still Huawei is allowed on the 5G network.
Yeah.
So,
And that's become increasingly popular. Like New Zealand, Australia, and U.S. have all banned them from the 5G networks. They're all removing them from the 3G and the 4G networks due to security risks, and it's because of the close ties with the company, with the Communist Party, and even with members who are like ex-security and ex-intelligence officers within Huawei.
That in a country where Huawei is operating on the 5G network, potentially the Chinese government could be spying on citizens of New Zealand, of America, of Australia. The thing is, that's odd is that this case is separate. From my viewpoint, this case it's the same company. I get it, but what the Americans are asking for, it's a separate charge than of espionage of the citizens. So
I think it's all tangled up together. It's all about the Sino-American relations.
I'm torn because on the one hand you've got conservatives calling for Huawei to be banned from the 5G network. You've got the Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister saying, look, we're going to let the police investigate this, and our Justice Minister will either sign off or not on extradition, and the Americans will try. Or it's kind of a Pontius Pilate sort of wash my hands of this situation. And you've got the Americans who are in a trade war who are clearly saying, look, we want to stick it to China. So this is why we're going to do it. I don't know what the best course of action is at this point.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to align ourselves with the States. And because I think...
So you think they should definitely extradite her to the States?
Yeah.
And let her be tried under American law.
Yeah, and I think we should participate with the United States in punishing Chinese unfair trade practices in a lot of ways. That's one of the main reasons that we have steel and aluminum tariffs, right? It's because there's so much dumping of Chinese steel and aluminum product into Canada that gets sold to the American to the U.S. through NAFTA, duty free. That was the initial reason for those tariffs. Like it's all about this weird relationship where, we've been kind of transitioning between these kind of two superpowers that the U.S. wants to keep us close and they want to punish us for getting close to China. We want to position ourselves well in case the Americans aren't the top dog on the block. There's all these things going on, but I think it's unrealistic to hurt our relationship with the U.S. in any ways. Like where our economies are just too tied together, and they will always be that way just because of culture and geography and all these reasons.
I would agree in broad strokes, but I would also say that this week I was pretty appreciative of what the Prime Minister and what Chrystia Freeland, the Foreign Affairs Minister, said. Like, they were basically emphasizing due process, and in the particular case of this woman who's the Chief Financial Officer, I think it's very important not to just, because of our broader goal, to be able to kind of toss her around from government to government and try her that way. I think if we're going to be a model of democracy, especially in the face of a communist government, we do have to show that we respect the rule of law. And so when Trudeau said, we respect the independence of our judiciary and we're going to let them do their work, I was like, right on, even if it's a Communist Party member, we should still try them with the right due process and let their lawyers make the argument.
I totally agree. I'm definitely getting caught up in the backroom politics.
And
at
hopefully
the end of the day,
hopefully the broader goal of us having a better trade relationship with America, who is our bigger trading partner, is realized.
Okay. So let's jump over to the First Ministers meeting.
First Ministers meeting. So Montreal is the site, is ground zero for a bit of a dust up, I think, this week.
Yeah. So apparently this Ministers meeting was requested by the premiers to meet with Justin Trudeau. The agenda that was set was not popular amongst the premiers, although it wasn't the most unreasonable of agendas. The two main topics they wanted to discuss were the new NAFTA agreement, and the other one was interprovincial trade barriers. So two definitely important federalist issues, right?
Yeah.
Now the provinces also had a pretty reasonable list of issues that they wanted to talk about, if you ask me. The carbon tax, given the kind of growing opposition in the provinces. Super reasonable to try and deal with that. And then the other one is the pipeline and oil kind of dilemma,
totally.
which both of which are also essential federalist issues. So there was a bunch of grandstanding. Doug Ford said he was not going to go if they didn't talk about what he wanted to talk about, which is like very Trumpian in my opinion.
Yeah.
It seems like it hasn't gone too rocky yet.
Well,
I haven't seen anything crazy.
I think
today.
when you look at this, you're seeing
Doug went
this growing frustration between the provincial premiers and the federal government. And the telling thing this week was that Premier Rachel Notley, so this is the NDP Premier of Alberta, is starting to get much testier with Justin Trudeau. And she was considered an ally.
Well, but that was all very dependent on the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
Totally,
and it was always very obviously so.
But you're talking a premier who was in some ways even more, left of Justin Trudeau on many issues, who agreed to a carbon tax, is now kind of walking back her rhetoric on carbon taxes, and has no pipeline, and is looking at buying rail cars and asking the federal government to also purchase rail car capacity to transport oil, because it's such a crisis. There are thousands of jobs tied to the oil industry in Alberta that have been lost completely. People out of work there. So because of that crisis, and because of the Ontario crisis with the GM plant, it's you have a Conservative Premier and NDP Premier, both of them angry with Justin Trudeau on this because it doesn't seem like the federal government can help in any way. I don't think there can be a successful meeting at all.
To make things even more fun, Brian
Pallister.
No. Blaine Higgs. That's Blaine who I mean.
Higgs
in New Brunswick, the new Conservative leader of New Brunswick, says he wants Energy East, which is, in my opinion, a very reasonable request.
The pipeline that goes from Alberta to New Brunswick.
Yeah, to get our oil to Tidewater
it hasn't been built, but
to bring some more economic growth to the Maritimes, to get Canada's oil to Tidewater. It seems like a very reasonable plan. But then on top of that, Legault gets into it and says no oil will be he didn't really say no oil will be passing through, but he said Quebec is against the kind of social impacts of oil, which kind of implies that they'd be obstructive. So it seems like, for a while we were speculating that Legault would kind of fall in line with the Conservative kind of push against it, but it looks like he's going to do differently, and it kind of makes sense because of the kind of lefty province that is Quebec. But then maybe this is just more of a political thing in that he realizes that he can be like the swing vote in this kind of situation. He can really be the tipping point and make it the majority of provinces all of a sudden in Quebec and Ontario, being a majority of the population, a majority of the provinces. But he's sitting on the fence being like, maybe I'll make things difficult and try and get my way, which is a very Quebec position.
It's such a Quebec position because on the one hand, he's so at odds with Trudeau's position on immigration because he actually campaigned.
But maybe that's how they get the capitulation, right?
Well, it's
we're going to do things that you say are unconstitutional from an immigration perspective, but we'll be on your side for pipelines. Well,
let's not get ahead of the viewers here. So Francois Legault he campaigned in Quebec and won, and plans to reduce immigration levels for Quebec. Now they have that right as a constitutional right to govern that, but that's at odds with what Trudeau's doing. And so on the other hand, with pipelines, Trudeau, if we're in all honesty, despite the fact that they've spent a lot of federal money buying a pipeline, I think the Trudeau government is pretty clear at this point is against the majority of pipeline projects that go through Canadian territory, including Energy East that would have gone through Quebec to New Brunswick, and the Northern Gateway pipeline that would have gone through BC. So
I've been thinking about this topic a lot this week because I do consider myself somewhat of an environmentalist, but I do totally disagree with all the ways that we are fighting to achieve environmental causes in Canada.
Yeah.
So it's like, and so often, especially in like our like modern kind of shock and awe kind of political discourse, it's like, if you disagree with something, you're against it. It's like, I disagree with the carbon tax,
what would you say are the best ways to what are the things that you would deal with in the environment?
I was thinking about making like a whole video on this because it's kind of a whole thing, but I don't think these like blanket like Paris Accord kind of solutions are going to be like effective at targeting the like accurately reducing emissions in the specialized ways that different countries can and should kind of achieve them. Like, it's going to hamper kind of the the growth of smaller countries that are just industrializing. Mm-hmm. It's going to cripple the economies of developed countries that and then like there's so many specific nuances in which the carbon tax, as an example, is ineffective to lower emissions in Canada. And if you look at Canada's like footprint, like if you look at at least our like energy production and stuff like that, it's wildly green. Like, it's incredibly impressively green. If you go province to province, and just if you search something as simple as like Quebec energy mix or Ontario energy mix, you can get a pie chart easily that breaks down their energy, and it's incredible. If you, other than Alberta, basically all the provinces use a majority sustainable energy. The hydroelectricity is like above 95% in Quebec, in Manitoba, a little bit less in Ontario, but we substitute using nuclear. That's another big divide that I have with a lot of environmentalists. There's a lot of anti-nuclear environmentalists. I'm very pro-nuclear. I would like to see pipelines going coast to coast in Canada. We can export our oil, which is like more socially has less negative social impacts than like something like Saudi oil, UAE, any of these countries. We make Alberta, instead of Alberta uses the most natural gas and oil, unsurprisingly, but we transform Alberta into like a nuclear powerhouse. They can maintain their energy kind of giant status, while having lower environmental impact, and like all of a sudden Canada's energy grids for every province are 95 plus green, and then the main area is cars. So that's what I think the big thing is. Yeah. So we need to make initiatives, and it doesn't even need to be domestic. We just need to make sure electrical cars are as cheap as possible, and we have the infrastructure to support them, because that's going to be the main area where we can massively reduce emissions. And like the public transportation thing is part of the argument, but ultimately in Canada, given like the kind of spread out nature of our country, cars are just necessary, especially for people in rural areas, but even for people in like suburban areas, like cars are hugely necessary, and public transit is hardly like financially viable in cities outside of Toronto and Vancouver.
I think there are some ways on that point for the federal government to look at some grand projects for intercity travel, like railway travel, because it's not very efficient or
the super high speed.
It's not very cheap for us to travel by train between cities, and that is part of the problem. That's the massive problem, is the per capita car ownership, in this country. With nuclear, I mean, the prairies could even potentially become exporters of nuclear energy.
We have a huge amount of nuclear resources.
We're talking about. I always say, we've talked about this before, but there's two things from my perspective that you need to have for good nuclear energy. You need to have a place that is geographically or politically stable, and you need to have somewhere that's geologically or seismically stable. So,
and that's Canada.
Yeah, you look at
all of it except for the West Coast.
Yeah, you look at Japan. That was Fukushima. That was not a great place because it's not geologically stable. It's a tiny bit of islands. You look at Iran. It's not going to be politically stable. But in the Canadian prairies, there's no civil wars. There's no earthquakes. it's the perfect place to build nuclear reactors, and I think that can solve it. I also think for environmentalism, like as conservatives talking about environmentalism, like things as simple, they're not simple issues, but as clean water, like protecting clean water, protecting the national parks, protecting the physical environment. I think a lot of the talk around global warming and climate change gets lost in these as you said, these Paris Accord solutions of, okay, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and that's the only environmental issue. But Brian Mulroney, for instance, worked really hard, thank you, with the American counterparts on acid rain, for instance, and that was very successful. So protecting our water, protecting our physical environment, I think that those are worthy goals as well for conservative environmentalists.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. Like I do consider myself an environmentalist, but I am skeptical of international agreements and institutions. I'm skeptical of big government solutions. I'm wary of government debts and deficits. I'm totally. Like there's so many other things to consider. Like I'm pro-market solutions. Like there's that warp my kind of environmentalism that doesn't fit the normal kind of red.
Totally, and that's
green.
why, like, realizing that nuclear energy, for instance, can spur innovation, technology, and good jobs. That's great. Recognizing that incentivizing people to actually buy cars that don't pollute as much, that's great. Those are better, like, tinkering of the market rather than imposing laws that artificially force people's hands.
And even last week we talked about, like, people were giving Doug Ford a lot of criticism because he eliminated, like, the electric car subsidy for GM before they left. But, like, now it goes to Mexico. What if we end up with even lower cost electric cars? Like, is that a negative impact? Like, Doug Ford didn't get to help this whole climate solution, but we still end up with cheaper electric cars.
It'll take time to see. Like, it could actually be, as you say, that more people end up buying electric cars because they're cheaper, because they're more affordable, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay. But I guess we'll finish off with Brian Mulroney, but we should do separatism sometime soon, because there's been so much talk about Alberta separatism.
So interesting, eh?
Which makes the United Conservative Party an even more interesting name choice.
Because, the fact that for so many years separatism in this country has been in Quebec, and now that there's a really serious talk, from national pundits of the possibility of Alberta separatist sentiment in the next Alberta election, which is just next year, it's going to be fascinating to watch. And
then I've seen a lot of talk about now Jason Kenney is not only in an interesting position as leader of the UCP, but even maybe as a future prime ministerial candidate.
Well,
because he gets this kind of Pierre Trudeau federalist leader kind of.
Let's segue into our last topic. Brian Mulroney this week said a few very interesting things.
Another interesting federalist fellow.
The one thing he said that the Prime Minister of Canada has two things that they need to worry about. And he even went so far as he said every other issue could be farmed out to the cabinet team. And he said the two issues that the Prime Minister of Canada needs to work on are national unity and the relationship with the U.S.
And this is why I disagree with them slipping off and sleeping on the side with China.
Well,
just be faithful to the U.S.
That's it.
Everything else comes second.
So he said those two things, and what was interesting was he was doing an interview because he had just given the eulogy for George H.W. Bush, so George Bush Sr., who passed away just a couple weeks ago, and Brian Mulroney is a very interesting figure because he was in power for 2 terms in Canada, and this is the second eulogy he's given for a major U.S. president, the last being Ronald Reagan. So
the two men that he worked on NAFTA with.
That he worked,
well, CUFTA and NAFTA.
Absolutely, that he worked on free trade with the U.S. on. So he had close relationships with both those families. Also, as a businessman, he just has a lot of close relationships with Americans in general, with Clinton as well, with Donald Trump. I don't know what his relationship with the Obamas is, but he gave this eulogy, and what was so striking was he's giving this eulogy, and he's got that great baritone voice, he's just could lull you to sleep, and he's
a good orator across the board.
He's telling great stories, and in the pews of this church are Donald Trump and Melania, Barack Obama and Michelle, and Bill Clinton, and on the very end, Hillary Clinton.
Well, don't forget Jimmy Carter just kind of
and they're all that's right, off to the side.
Kind of looking like an alien.
But the image that was often cropped was these, you have Trump on one side and Hillary, who are the two candidates, and you've got the spouses and the Obamas and, all together. And then, of course, George Bush Jr., George W. Bush. And
handing her candy again.
And Jeb Bush were there in another pew with the family, right? And
there was a really funny line when he talked about Jeb, and then he talked about George, and then he's like,
right.
And their real pride, George. It was like, yeah, classic Jeb sucks. Like,
yep.
Another cute moment of George W. giving Michelle candy.
Yeah, I think that
happened.
I think
that happened.
I
think the same thing happened at maybe it was reversed, but some candy trade went on at what's his mother? I forget their mother's name. Barbara Bush.
Yeah.
Not Nancy. That's Nancy Reagan.
Yep.
Barbara Bush's funeral. I think there was a similar candy exchange. Maybe it was reversed, and he was giving it back. Where
it was some kind of cute moment there.
But the media jumped on it both times. And
George
Bush is a cute old man.
I mean,
despite his
accused
war crimes and
totally. But I think that it was neat that apart from that grouping of the Trumps, Obamas, and Clintons, the rest of the affair seemed very stately with the Bushes, with Brian Mulroney. It seemed a very fitting tribute to this politician.
But no Trudeau.
And that's.
It looked pretty bad. Like it was a.
I don't know. Is it bad? Because George Herbert Walker Bush was president when Trudeau was
our age,
a teenager, basically.
But still, it does speak to the Canadian American kind of foreign affairs currently that the current prime minister wasn't there, or at least the governor general.
I think it speaks to the fact that Brian Mulroney is the statesman in Canada. I think,
but it still seems like at least the governor general should have been there.
Maybe. I think I don't know. I don't know what protocol is, but I think that Brian Mulroney has actually, in the long run, done more for the profile of Canada than any prime minister.
What? I don't know about that, but
who would you say?
I wasn't expecting that statement. Like, I'm so ill prepared for this.
I just think
But I was reading today that it was kind of precedent that the Canadian prime minister generally shows up to these, if not the governor general.
Okay.
But the disparity was just even wider because Brian Mulroney had such a nice eulogy.
Totally.
And he's such a good speaker compared to Justin Trudeau, and he joked jovially, and he has such a beautiful voice, and on every side he made Trudeau look like such a
didn't it seem odd too
moron
that for these past weeks, former Canadian prime ministers have been in the spotlight. Stephen Harper was on the Ben Shapiro show and got a whole bunch of press coverage because he has a new book out, and he's on that. Jean Chrétien has a new book out and did an interview with Paul Wells for Maclean's magazine, and has been making the circuit media rounds on CBC and on Tout le monde en parle in Quebec. So you've got Harper, Chrétien, Mulroney, and Trudeau, of course, is always making headlines. The only one not seeing as much of this week is Paul Martin.
Yeah, he's always kind of pretty quiet.
He's kind of been a little subdued,
It's weird because he's a pretty popular prime minister as far as I can tell.
He's pretty popular, but he served for a short time, right? It was only a couple of years, right?
And I feel like he did some sort of op-ed or something in the last few weeks with when the USMCA was in the news or something like that. I remember seeing his name once, but yeah, I definitely think he is more downplayed than most of the other guys.
Fun fact, I know we're running over time here,
Yeah,
but,
we can end this.
But did you know I did a conference call with Paul Martin?
No, I did not.
Yeah.
What was that?
Well, we're old buddies. You know, we like
you and Paul.
Paul, I call up Paul sometimes and I say, hey, I'm working on an assignment. Can you help me? No, basically what happened was St. Jerome's University that I'm affiliated with. I have the ring here. I graduated from St. Jerome's. They were honoring him with an award, and he actually went to high school with the chancellor, Jim Beingessner of St. Jerome's University at Waterloo. And they were honoring him with an award, and he was going to accept it. And so there was a whole planned event, because he's really involved with Indigenous reconciliation. Yeah. So there was a whole planned event where he would meet with a bunch of students, and we do an Indigenous elder ceremony, and then he would come to the dinner and accept the award. So what was amazing was all of the poli-sci profs at Waterloo bought tickets to the dinner.
Yeah.
Because there were the premise.
A lot of friendly faces there for you.
know. And so there were a whole bunch of people who were planning on coming. And earlier in the day was going to be kind of an intimate meeting with a bunch of students. And I got invited because I had been president of the Students' Union there at St. Jerome. So I got invited to this. And there were a bunch of Indigenous students there. And the day before, or the day or two before, he got sick.
Oh,
literally got sick, and he said, I don't want to disappoint the students. He said, I can't make it to the dinner, so someone will accept on my behalf and whatever, but I don't want to disappoint the students. So he said, I will call in. So we actually had just about a dozen of us around a table, and we had the phone there, and he called in, and we got to talk to him, and then we had a question and answer. And I actually asked him, because at the time I was in a fourth year poli-sci course, and we were reading his articles on democratic deficit and all this kind of thing. So I was kind of jittery. I got on the phone and I asked him. I said, I want to ask you about democratic deficit and all of this, and he was great. He answered the questions and whatever. We ended up doing the ceremony with the elder. He wasn't there, obviously, and then we had the dinner. But it was bittersweet but satisfying that all these poli-sci profs came, and they didn't know that he was sick, so they came expecting Paul Martin, and then they had to announce, he got sick and can't come, and inwardly I was going, I got a phone call with him. So
that's pretty great. I think let's wrap this up.
Yeah, anyway, we want to thank everyone for watching the show, and as always, if there are topics that you want us to talk about on the show here on True North News, if you want to write articles for us, if you have friends or people that you think should be on the show or should be contributing to True North News, we would love to hear from them. So just get in touch with us either on Facebook or on our YouTube page or Instagram or
Gmail.
Twitter.
We're all over the place.
And we will get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you so much for watching. And from all of us here at True North News, stay informed, friends.